Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So this afternoon I'm going to go through another sutta. This is Majjhima Nikaya 22, the Alagaddupama Sutta, which covers several different topics actually, and includes some of the most well-known similes used by the Buddha. The simile of the snake and the simile of the raft are both found in this sutta. The first topic that the sutta covers is the chastisement of the bhikkhu Aritta, who was misrepresenting the Buddha's doctrine. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Sawati in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Now on that occasion a pernicious view had arisen in a bhikkhu named Aritta, formerly of the vulture killers. Thus, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, those things called obstructions by the Blessed One are not able to obstruct one who engages in them. So first of all, this character Aritta is identified as formerly of the vulture killers, so it already sounds like a kind of disreputable character. And he was teaching that those things called obstructions by the Buddha are not actually obstructions for one who engages in them. So that's kind of vague as it stands, but the commentary clarifies this, that he was teaching that it's actually all right for bhikkhus to engage in sexual relations. And then in the following section of the sutta, the Buddha, as we'll see, he gives some similes regarding the nature of sensual pleasure. So the commentary is probably on the mark here. And it's also to be noted that in the Vinaya, the one rule that covers or deals with teachings by bhikkhus makes it an offense for a bhikkhu to teach that it's all right for that there is no danger in sensual relations. So the idea of the celibacy for the bhikkhus was very important and central to the whole nature of a bhikkhu life, and it's also seen that this the very first parajika offense. In any case, Bhikkhu Aritta was disputing that. So several bhikkhus, having heard about this, went to the Bhikkhu Aritta and asked him, "Friend Aritta, is it true that such a pernicious view has arisen in you?" "Exactly so, friend. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, those things called obstructions by the Blessed One are not able to instruct the one who engages in them." Then these bhikkhus, desiring to detach him from that pernicious view, pressed and questioned and cross-examined him thus: "Friend Aritta, do not say so. Do not misrepresent the Blessed One. It is not good to misrepresent the Blessed One. The Blessed One would not speak thus. For in many discourses the Blessed One has stated how obstructive things are obstructions, and they are able to obstruct one who engages in them. The Blessed One has stated how sensual pleasure provides little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them. With the simile of the skeleton, with the simile of the piece of meat, with the simile of the grass torch, with the simile of the pit of coals, with the simile of the dream, with the simile of borrowed goods, with the simile of a tree laden with fruit, with the simile of the slaughterhouse, with the simile of the sword stake, with the simile of the snake's head. The Blessed One has stated how much sensual pleasure provides little gratification, much suffering, much despair, and great is the danger in them. In this sutta, the similes are not expanded upon, but most of them are expanded upon in another sutta. So I'll go through those in brief. The simile of the skeleton. To suppose that a hungry dog was waiting by a butcher's shop, and the butcher threw out a piece of meatless bone and tossed it to the dog. Do you think the dog would get rid of his hunger and weakness by gnawing such a skeleton of meatless bones? Why is that? Because the skeleton consists of meatless bones. Eventually, the dog would reap weariness and disappointment. So the idea here is that sensual pleasures are like the meatless bone, that one gnaws on them but one's never satisfied. The piece of meat is, the simile expanded, is that if a vulture, crow, or hawk seized a piece of meat and flew away, and then other vulture, crows, and hawks flew up and attacked it, pecking and clawing, if that a vulture, crow, or hawk does not quickly let go of the piece of meat, wouldn't it incur death and deadly suffering? Blazing grass torch. The simile is a man holding a blazing grass torch against the wind, and it blows back onto his hand. The simile of the charcoal pit. Suppose there were a charcoal pit deeper than a man's height, full of glowing coals. Then a man who wanted to live and not to die, who wanted pleasure and recoil from pain, was seized by two strong men and dragged towards the pit. Would he not twist his body this way and that? The simile of the park. Suppose a man dreamt about lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely lakes, and on waking he saw nothing of it. So sensual pleasures is like a dream. Having seen this as it actually is with proper wisdom, he ceases to cling to the material things of the world. Goods on loan. Sensual pleasures are like borrowed goods on loan. One borrows a fancy carriage, fine jeweled earrings, and so forth. And people saw him, and when he went to the marketplace, here is a rich man, see how the rich enjoy their wealth. Then the owners would take back their things. Would that not enough for that man to become dejected? So sensual pleasures are like enjoying borrowed goods. The tree laden with fruit. A man comes across a tree laden with fruit, and he climbs the tree to get the fruit. And as he's up in the branches, another man comes along and sees a tree laden with fruit, and not seeing the first man, he decides to chop the tree down to get the fruit. So would not that first man come to destruction? So there are several of these similes that were cited by the bhikkhus, so obviously they were well known to them. The Buddha probably used them often. Yet, although pressed and questioned and cross-questioned, the bhikkhu Arita, formerly of the vulture killers, still obstinately adhered to that pernicious view and continued to insist upon it. Since the bhikkhus were unable to attach him from that view, they went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to them, they sat down on one side and told him all that occurred. Then the Blessed One addressed a certain bhikkhu thus: Come, bhikkhu, tell the bhikkhu Arita, formerly of the vulture killers, in my name that the teacher calls him. So Arita comes to the Blessed One, and Buddha questions him, does he hold this view? Yes, he does. The Buddha's reply: Misguided man, to whom have you ever known me to teach the Dhamma in this way? Misguided man, in many discourses have I not stated how obstructive things are obstructions, how they are able to obstruct one who engages in them? I have stated how they are able to obstruct one who engages in them. I have stated how sensual pleasure provides little gratification, much suffering, much despair, and how great is the danger in them. Then he goes through that whole list of similes again. But you, misguided man, have misrepresented us by your wrong grasp and injured yourself and stored up much demerit, for this will lead to your harm and suffering for a long time. Then the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus thus: Bhikkhus, what do you think? Has the bhikkhu Arata, formerly of the vulture killers — they always have to identify him as formerly of the vulture killers — kindled even a spark of wisdom in this Dhamma and discipline? How could he, venerable sir? No, venerable sir. When this was said, the bhikkhu Arata, formerly of the vulture killers, sat silent, dismayed, with shoulders drooping and head down, glum and without response. Then, knowing this, the Blessed One said, Misguided man, you will be recognized by your own pernicious views. I shall question the bhikkhus on this matter. Then the Buddha basically goes to the same material again, asking the bhikkhus what they think, and they cite the similes again. And bhikkhus, that one can engage in sensual pleasure without sensual desire, without perception of sensual desire, without thoughts of sensual desire, that is impossible. Pali uses the word kama, K-A-M-A, for both sensual desire and sensual pleasure. So then we move on to a different section of the discourse, the simile of the snake. And this deals with how one should handle the teachings. Here, bhikkhus, some misguided men, they learn the Dhamma, discourses, stanzas, expositions, verses, exclamations, sayings, birth stories, marvels, and answers to questions. But having learned the Dhamma, they do not examine the meaning of those teachings with wisdom. Not examining the meaning of those teachings with wisdom, they do not gain a reflective acceptance of them. Instead, they learn the Dhamma only for the sake of criticizing others and for winning in debates, and they do not experience the good for the sake of which they learned the Dhamma. Those teachings, being wrongly grasped by them, conduce to their harm and suffering for a long time. Suppose a man needing a snake, seeking a snake, wandering in search of a snake, saw a large snake and grasped its coils or its tail. It would turn back on him and bite his hand or his arm or one of his limbs, and because of that he would come to death or deadly suffering. Why is that? Because of his wrong grasp of the snake. So too here some misguided men learn the Dhamma, etc. These teachings, being wrongly grasped by them, conduce to their harm and suffering for a long time. So this is the Buddha advising not to cling to the letter but to the spirit. We have a parallel saying in Christianity. They say even the devil can quote scripture for his own ends. Right? It's possible to have a book knowledge, a surface knowledge of the Dhamma without understanding or penetrating the meaning, and just being able to quote back stanzas to make oneself sound clever. And this is compared to the Buddha as grabbing a snake by the tail. Yes, you should take up the Dhamma, but take it up properly, and don't grab the snake by the tail and let it bite you. Then he goes on to describe the opposite case, someone who holds the Dhamma properly. Here, bhikkhus, some clansmen learn the Dhamma, discourses, answers to questions, etc., and having learned the Dhamma, they examine the meaning of those teachings with wisdom. Examining the meaning of those teachings with wisdom, they gain a reflective acceptance of them. They do not learn the Dhamma for the sake of criticizing others or for winning in debates, and they experience the good for the sake of which they learned the Dhamma. Those teachings, being rightly grasped by them, conduce to their welfare and happiness for a long time. Suppose a man needing a snake, seeking a snake, wandering in search of a snake, saw a large snake and caught it rightly with a cleft stick, and having done so, grasped it rightly by the neck. Then, although that snake might wrap its coils around his hand or his arm or his limbs, still he would not come to death or deadly suffering, because of that. Why? Because of the right grasp of the snake. So too here, some clansmen learn the Dhamma. Those teachings being rightly grasped by them conduce to their welfare and happiness for a long time. Therefore, bhikkhus, when you understand the meaning of my statements, remember it accordingly, and when you do not understand the meaning of my statements, then ask either me about it or those bhikkhus who are wise. So we should always remember that the Dhamma is intended for our liberation, for our raising of our level of consciousness, for the escape from suffering, for realizing the unconditioned. It's not for sounding clever, being able to win debates, to score intellectual points. And this debating and intellectual sparring is something that was common in Indian culture. It's baked into the Indian culture that they liked and still do. From what I hear, that they like these kind of intellectual debates and to outsmart their opponent. But that's not the purpose of the Dhamma. Then he goes on to talk about the simile of the raft. This is one of the well-known similes of the Buddha. Bhikkhus, I shall show you how the Dhamma is similar to a raft, for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of grasping. So again, this is about holding the Dhamma properly with wisdom. Listen and attend closely. Yes, Venerable Sir. The Blessed One said thus, Bhikkhu, suppose a man is in the course of a journey, and he saw a great expanse of water, whose near shore was dangerous and fearful, and whose further shore was safe and free from fear. But there was no ferry boat or bridge. Then he thought, there is this great expanse of water, etc., but there is no ferry boat or bridge. Suppose I collect grass, twigs, branches, and leaves, binding them together into a raft, and supported by the raft and making an effort with my hands and feet, I could get safely across to the far shore. And then the man collected the grass, twigs, etc., bound them together into a raft, made an effort with his hands and feet, and got safely to the far shore. Then when he had got across and arrived at the far shore, he might think thus, this raft has been very helpful to me, since supported by it and making an effort with my hands and feet, I got across safely to the far shore. Suppose I were to hoist it on my head or load it on my shoulders, and then go wherever I want. Now, because what do you think? By doing so, would that man be doing what should be done with the raft? No, Venerable Sir. By doing what would that man be doing what should be done with the raft? Here, because when that man has got across, he might think thus, this raft has been helpful to me, since supported by it and making an effort with my hands and feet, I got safely across to the far shore. Suppose I were to haul it onto dry land or set it adrift in the water and then go wherever I want. Now, bhikkhus, it is by so doing that a man would be doing what should be done with that raft. So I have shown you how the Dhamma is similar to a raft, being for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of grasping. Bhikkhus, when you know the Dhamma to be similar to a raft, you should abandon even good states, how much more so bad states. So this is a very important simile, often cited, and I think sometimes misunderstood, that the Dhamma compared to a raft, and one should not cling and grasp to the Dhamma. This is an injunction against dogmatism, but also to understand the purpose of the Dhamma is to cross to the far shore, is to reach liberation. Now, the far shore is often a metaphor for, in the Buddhist teaching, is often a metaphor for nibbana. Now, the near shore is samsara, and you cross over and reach nibbana. But where I think that sometimes people take this too far is that they they think that they can start breaking up the raft in the middle of the stream. That the particular application of this simile, I think, relates to meditation practice, is that we have these techniques of meditation, such as the various ways of doing anapanasati, the various ways of doing vipassana, metta, and so on. And there are specific methodologies that have been developed and been used for a long time and have been well worked out and honed. And they're very skillful methodologies, but it's always important to remember that that's what they are. They're techniques or methods for accessing particular states of mind. They're a means to an end. They're not in themselves the end or the goal. So something like a particular method of vipassana, like Mahasi method or the Goenka method, could be compared to the raft. But to abandon the raft before one has reached the goal is as foolish as clinging hopelessly to the raft. And I think that the moment of trying to climb out onto the far shore, you wouldn't try to climb out of the far shore with the raft on your back. That's the time to climb out of the shore, let go. And to reach that state of liberation, one must let go of everything. It must be a total abandonment, and that includes even abandoning the meditation practice at that moment. But to do so prematurely, you would just flounder in the water. Then the Buddha goes on to yet another theme, talking about views. In general, bhikkhus, there are these 6 standpoints for views. And views are ditthis, ways of holding reality. And ditthi is often, there's samaditthi, right view, but when it's used just by itself as ditthi, it usually refers to erroneous views or false views. What are the 6 standpoints for views? Here, bhikkhus, an ordinary untaught person who has no regard for the noble ones, who is unskilled and undisciplined in the Dhamma, who has no regard for true men, and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards material form thus: this is me, this is mine, this is myself. He regards feeling thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. He regards perception thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. He regards formations thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. He regards what is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, encountered, sought, or mentally pondered thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. So this is the first 5 correspond basically to the 5 aggregates. The last one is a little different, but it's taking the objects of vijnana. And then the 6th standpoint: this is self, this is the world. After death I shall be permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change. I shall endure as long as eternity. This too he regards as: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. So atta view, atman, the view of the imperishable self. Bhikkhus, a well-taught noble disciple who has regard for noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, who does have regard for true men and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, regards material form thus: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Likewise with feelings, perception, and the rest. And finally, this standpoint for views: this is self, this is the world, after death I shall be permanent, etc. This too he regards thus: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Since he regards them thus, he is not agitated about what is not existent. He is not agitated about what is non-existent. So if you don't regard any of the aggregates as self, then you don't get agitated. It's that emptiness, there's no place to stand to become upset or agitated. There's a freedom in there. There's a real immediate experienced benefit whenever you have some deeper appreciation of emptiness, of not self. It immediately frees the mind and reduces fear, reduces agitation, reduces all kinds of mental suffering. So then, going on with the theme of agitation, a certain bhikkhu asked the Blessed One, "Venerable Sir, can there be agitation about what is non-existent externally?" "Yes, there can be. Here, bhikkhu, someone thinks thus: alas, I had it. Alas, I have it no longer. Alas, may I have it. Alas, I do not get it. Then he sorrows, grieves, and laments, and weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught." This is how there is agitation about what is non-existent eternally. When you put it that way, it really sounds foolish to become upset about what doesn't exist. You know? Venerable Sir, can there be no agitation about what is non-existent eternally? There can be, bhikkhus. Here someone does not think, alas, I had it, alas, I have it no longer, etc. Then he does not sorrow, grieve, and lament. He does not weep, beating his breast, and become distraught. That is how there is no agitation about what is non-existent eternally. And the really difference here, and the salient point, is that it isn't the lack of some desired object that, or the loss of something, that makes you agitated. It's your own reaction to it that's causing the agitation. If you are able to see, this is non-existent, I don't have it, so that's it. That's the state of nature. That's the way things are. Then you don't get agitated. Venerable Sir, can there be agitation about what is non-existent internally? There can be. Someone has this view: this is self, this is the world. After death I shall be permanent, everlasting, eternal. I shall endure as long as eternity. Then he hears the Tathagata, or a disciple of the Tathagata, teaching the Dhamma for the elimination of standpoints, decisions, obsessions, adherences, underlying tendencies, for the stilling of all formations, for the relinquishment of all attachments, for the destruction of craving, for dispassion, for cessation, for nibbana. He thinks thus: so I shall be annihilated, so I shall perish, so I shall be no more. So he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught. That is how there is agitation about what is non-existent eternally. So for someone who has an entrenched self-view, when they encounter teachings about cessation, non-attachment, relinquishment, dispassion, nibbana, they can react with a sense of distress. They think, I shall be annihilated. But if they don't have a view of self to begin with, there's nothing to be annihilated, then they don't become upset. Can there be no agitation about what is non-existent internally? Here, bhikkhu, someone does not hold the view, this is self, etc. Then he hears the Tathagata, or disciple, teaching the Dhamma for the elimination of standpoints, decisions, etc. For dispassion, cessation, nibbana, he does not think thus: so I shall be annihilated, so I shall perish, so I shall be no more. Then he does not sorrow, grieve, and lament. He does not weep, beating his breast, and become distraught. That is how there is no agitation about what is non-existent internally. See, there was criticisms even in the Buddhist time and in other suttas, and you still hear versions of it today from some quarters, that the Buddha taught annihilation, that he taught destruction of the self. But what he actually taught was there's no self to begin with to be annihilated. So what are you talking about? If there's no self to be annihilated, then there's no annihilation. Then he goes on to a different theme of impermanence and not self. So it's again developing the theme of not self from a different angle. Because you may acquire that possession that is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change, and that might endure as long as eternity. But do you see any such possession, bhikkhus? No, sir. Good, bhikkhus. I too do not see any possession that is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change, and that might endure as last as eternity. You may well cling to that doctrine of self that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who clings to it. But do you see any such doctrine of self? No, bhikkhus. No, venerable sir. Good bhikkhus. I too do not see any doctrine of self that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who clings to it. So holding to the idea, the doctrine of self, leads to suffering. Bhikkhus, you may well take as a supportive view, as a support, that view that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who takes it as a support. But do you see any such supportive views? No, venerable sir. Good bhikkhus, I do not see any supportive views that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, the one who takes it as a support. And the supportive views, the commentary explains that's a reference to the 62 false views in the Brahmajala Sutta, all that have some support in terms of some theory of self. Bhikkhus, there being a self, would there be what belongs to a self? Yes, venerable sir. Or there being what belongs to a self, would there be myself? Yes, venerable sir. Bhikkhus, since the self and what belongs to a self are not apprehended as true and established, then this standpoint for views, namely, this is self, this is the world, after death I shall be permanent, everlasting, not subject to change, I shall endure to eternity, would it not be utterly and completely foolish teaching? What else could it be, venerable sir? It would be an utterly and completely foolish teaching. What do you think, bhikkhus? Is material form permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, venerable sir. Is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? Suffering, venerable sir. In what is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change fit to be regarded thus? This is me, this is mine, I am this is myself? No, venerable sir. No. So on with the rest of the aggregates. So this is an argument or a way of exposition that the Buddha uses in a few other places as well. He goes through the aggregates and he says, is this body, or these perceptions, etc., are they permanent or subject to change? No, they're subject to change. And because they're subject to change, then they're causes of suffering. Because what changes and falls away, we experience as suffering. And what is impermanent and suffering cannot be a permanent, enduring self. It cannot be an Atman. So no Atman can be found. When we go through the five aggregates and we see that that's the entirety of a being, and it's all impermanent, subject to change, suffering. Therefore, bhikkhus, any kind of material form whatsoever, whether past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior, superior, far or near, all material form should be seen as it actually is, with proper wisdom thus: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Any kind of feeling whatsoever, any kind of perception or formations of consciousness, whether past, future, present, internal, external, gross or subtle, inferior, superior, far or near. All consciousness should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Seeing thus, bhikkhus, a well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with material form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with formations, disenchanted with consciousness. Being disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through this passion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge it is liberated. He understands, birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What has to be done has been done. There is no more coming to any state of being. So this is the critical stages leading to full awakening, beginning with disenchantment, which is a nibbida. As the mind is no longer fooled by the objects of samsara. Nibbida is a word that's difficult to translate and has been translated different ways. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi's use of disenchantment is the best, is the closest, because there's the sense of before that you're bewitched, enchanted, or deluded. But now you see through it. You see, this is not me, this is not mine, this is impermanent, this is subject to change, this is suffering. And when you see through it in that way with wisdom, then you become dispassionate. The desire, the passion for these objects fades, and then the mind can break free, it becomes liberated, and it realizes the unconditioned. Then he has a section on describing the state of the liberated being, the arahant. Bhikkhus, this bhikkhu is called one whose shaft has been lifted, whose trench has been filled in, whose pillar has been uprooted, who has no bar, a noble one whose banner is lowered, whose burden is lowered, who is unfettered. And he goes on to expand these epithets or similes. Then how is the bhikkhu one whose shaft has been lifted? Here the bhikkhu has abandoned ignorance, has cut it off at the root, made it like a palm stump, done away with it, so that it is no longer subject to future arising. That is how the bhikkhu is one whose shaft has been lifted. And how is the bhikkhu one whose trench has been filled in? Here the bhikkhu has abandoned the round of births that brings renewal of being, has cut it off at the root, so he is no longer subject to future arising. That's how the bhikkhu is one whose trench has been filled in. And how is the bhikkhu one whose pillar has been uprooted? Here the bhikkhu has abandoned craving, has cut it off at the root, so it is no longer subject to future arising. And how is the bhikkhu one who has no bar? Here the bhikkhu has abandoned the 5 lower fetters, has cut them off at the root, so they are no longer subject to future arising. That is how the bhikkhu is one who has no bar. The 5 lower fetters are the 3 fetters that are overcome at stream entry, that all relate to the view, the Sakaya Ditti, or the personality view, rite and rituals clinging, and skeptical doubt. And the 2 middle fetters are included here, are sensual desire and ill will. And how is the bhikkhu a noble one whose banner is lowered, whose burden is lowered, who is unfettered? Here a bhikkhu has abandoned the conceit I am, has cut it off at the root, so that he is no longer subject to future arising. That is how the bhikkhu is a noble one, whose banner is lowered, whose burden is lowered, who is unfettered. So here the conceit I am is asmamana. That's the form of self-view based on perception that's only abandoned at arahantship. So it's the most subtle form of self-view. Bhikkhus, when the gods with Indra, with Brahma, with Pajapati seek a bhikkhu who is thus liberated in mind, they do not find anything of which they could say, the consciousness of one thus gone is supported by this. Why is that? Because one thus gone, I say, is untraceable here and now. So this stanza references the idea that the mind of the Arahant, or the liberated one, finds no footing. It needs no support. It's absolutely liberated. And the idea that he can't be traced or found, it occurs in one sutta when he attained arahantship right at the moment of death, and Mara was trying to prevent that. And then when he died, the bhikkhus saw this smoke, this dark smoke sort of twirling around the area, and the Buddha explained that's Mara seeking here and there and everywhere to try and find that bhikkhu, but he can't be found, he cannot be traced. Misrepresentation of the Tathagata. So this is the next section. So saying, bhikkhus, so proclaiming, I have been baselessly, vainly, falsely and wrongly represented by some recluses and Brahmins, that is, samanas and Brahmins, who say thus, the recluse Gautama is one who leads astray. He teaches annihilation, destruction, extermination of an existing being. As I am not, as I do not proclaim, so I have been baselessly, vainly, falsely and wrongly misrepresented by some recluses and Brahmins thus. The recluse Gautama is one who leads astray. He teaches annihilation, destruction, extermination of living beings. Bhikkhus, both formally and now, what I teach is suffering and the cessation of suffering. This is the shortest summary of the Buddha's teaching. What he teaches is suffering and the end of suffering. So it's always practical in that way. If others abuse, revile, scold, and harass the Tathagata for that, the Tathagata on that account feels no annoyance, bitterness, or dejection of the heart. And if others honor, revere, respect, and venerate the Tathagata on that account feels no delight, joy, or elation of the heart. If others honor, respect, revere, and venerate the Tathagata for that, the Tathagata thinks they perform such services as these for the sake of what had earlier come to be fully understood. Therefore, bhikkhus, if others abuse, revile, scold, and harass you, on that account you should not entertain any annoyance or dejection of the heart. And if others honor and venerate you, you should not entertain any joy or elation. If others honor, respect, revere, and venerate you on that account, you should think thus, they perform such services as these for the sake of what had earlier come to be fully understood. Therefore, bhikkhus, whatever is not yours, abandon it. When you have abandoned it, that will lead to your welfare and happiness for a long time. And what is not yours? Material form is not yours. Abandon it. When you have abandoned it, that will lead to your happiness and welfare for a long time. Feeling is not yours. Abandon it. Perception, formations, consciousness is not yours. Abandon it. When you have abandoned it, that will lead to your welfare and happiness for a long time. Then the bhikkhu gives the simile of the firewood sticks. I really like this one. Bhikkhus, what do you think? If people carried off the grass, sticks, and branches and leaves in this jeta grove, or burned them, or did what they liked with them, would you think people are carrying off or burning us, or doing what they like with us? No, venerable sir, why not? Because that is neither our self nor belongs to self. So too, bhikkhus, what is not yours, abandon it. When you have abandoned it, that will lead to your welfare and happiness for a long time. What is not yours? Material form is not yours. Feeling is not yours. Perception is not yours. Formation is not yours. Consciousness is not yours. Abandon it. When you have abandoned it, that will lead to your welfare and happiness for a long time. So this is a very powerful thought experiment. It goes beyond just a mere simile. And when you see people taking away firewood sticks, you don't get upset. So you should have that same attitude towards your body, towards your feelings, towards your consciousness, etc. Have that same degree of detachment. Bhikkhus, this Dhamma proclaimed by me is clear, open, evident, and free of patchwork. In the Dhamma proclaimed by me, which is clear, open, evident, and free of patchwork, there is no future round for manifestation in the case of those bhikkhus or arahants who taste to destroy, who lived the holy life, what had to be done, lay down the burden, reached the goal, destroyed the fetter of being, and are completely liberated through final knowledge. In the Dhamma well proclaimed by me, those bhikkhus who have abandoned the 5 lower fetters are all due to reappear spontaneously in the pure abodes and there attain final nibbana without ever returning from this world. So in this section he's going in a kind of backwards order through the different states of attainment, beginning with an arahant, and then the arahant is one who's completely finished the task, become completely liberated. But just short of that are the anagami, who have surpassed the 5 lower fetters, but still are bound by the 5 deeper fetters. And they're still subject to rebirth, but not in the sensual planes and not in the human realm, but they are reborn in the Pure Land, and there they attain nibbana. That's why they're called anagami, non-returner, because they never return to this human state. The Dhamma well proclaimed by me, clear, free of patchwork, etc. Those bhikkhus who have abandoned the 3 lower fetters and attenuated lust, hate, and delusion are once returners, returning once to this world to make an end of suffering. So this is the Sakadagami, one who has abandoned the 3 lower fetters and weakened or attenuated the 2 middle fetters, that is ill will and sensual desire. They're still present, but they're very weak in a Sakadagami. One way I've heard that defined is that for a bhikkhu who is a Sakadagami, they would never disrobe for reasons of sensual desire. Sensual desire might arise in the mind as a passing thought, but it would not motivate action. Bhikkhus, this Dhamma well proclaimed by me thus, clear, free of patchwork, etc. There are those bhikkhus who have abandoned the 3 lower fetters, that are stream enterers, no longer subject to perdition, bound for deliverance and headed for enlightenment. So a stream winner or sotapanna has broken the 3 lower fetters relating to view, and they're no longer subject to perdition, meaning they can no longer be reborn in a lower realm. And it's not stated here, but a stream winner can only be reborn 7 more times, and it will always be human or higher. Then he has 2 more stanzas, and to complete the sutta. The bhikkhus, the Dhamma well proclaimed by me thus, etc. There are those bhikkhus who are Dhamma followers or faith followers and headed for enlightenment. So this is someone who's not yet attained stream entry, but is bound for it and is on the path towards it, and it's they're classified as 2 types, and this comes up elsewhere as well. There are Dhamma followers and faith followers. So they're people who are followers who are motivated either principally by the intellect or by the heart. They either go by penetration by mind or penetration by faith. You can see this in the real world in individuals who are on the path. They tend to either be one type or the other. I've wondered if this could relate somewhat to left brain, right brain approach. The intellectual approach or the holistic or heart-based approach. And it's also in the Visuddhimagga, there's classification of beings, personality types according to what their principal defilements are. And the simplest is to break them into 3 types: the greed types, the hatred types, and the deluded types. And everybody There's going to be some mix, but you're going to be predominantly one or the other. And they unfold differently as they mature spiritually. The sensual desire type tends to unfold through faith. So this would relate to the faith followers. The ill will or angry types, they tend to unfold through the intellect. And I think the way that would work is that anger or ill will turns into an impatience with ignorance. That you want to break through. You want to not be confused anymore. And an interesting one is a deluded type. They're said to unfold through psychic powers. They develop psychic powers most easily. And I think the way that works is if someone's deluded, they're in a very deep states of confusion. They can't tell reality from imagination, or did that happen or did I dream it? Sort of thing. And then if some little trace of psychic power starts to arise in a person, like you hear somebody else's thought, then if you're a rational type person, you would dismiss it and say, "Oh, it's just my imagination," and so you never nourish that seed. But the deluded person tends to believe everything, so they just go with it, and it matures in them. And the final stanza, the Dhamma well proclaimed by me thus, etc. There are those bhikkhus who have sufficient faith in me, sufficient love for me. They are all headed for heaven. So if you're at the the very lowest level of the Buddhist teaching, where you just have a kind of reflexive faith in the Buddha, then at least you'll be reborn in heaven, in the heaven realms. This is what the Blessed One said: the bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's word. So this is a bit of a portmanteau sutta. There's quite a bit of different stuff in here, and it's probably one of the most diverse collection of similes in any sutta. We have that whole string of similes for sensual desire. Then there's the simile of the snake, the simile of the raft, and then later on there's the simile of the firewood sticks, and then there's all the little short similes relating to the state of arahantship. This is something the Buddha used often as a teaching vehicle, is similes and parables, and ways of leading the mind into the truth by analogy rather than directly confronting it. Can sometimes be more productive, can bring you along by comparing it to something that's familiar, and then you can say, "Oh yeah, okay, that I can see now. It's like that."
Sadhu, sadhu.